Coming up on the Tall Mike Wine Podcast.
I'm sorry I didn't have time to get a trophy made. Most popular episode of 2023, but nice work on that anyway.
And to you, I was really surprised and gratified to hear that. I always say of Vignes, it's the best of wines and it's the worst of wines. It's a variety that can be so delicious, or it can get very ripe and very boozy and kind of Jolly Rancher flavored.
It's a region that I love saying, Gigondas.
And now, the Tall Mike Wine Podcast.
The cell phones have been silenced. The wine is poured. And just like that, the podcast begins. The wine podcast that's not all about wine. The wine podcast like no other. Welcome to it. I'm your host, Mike Stone, and my best conversations aren't always about wine, but they typically involve sipping some nice wines. This is the wine podcast heard in 71 countries on 6 continents and in 48 of these United States. Coast to coast, from Dublin, California to Yakima, Washington, from Charlotte, North Carolina to Newark, Delaware, former home of the Chrysler Newark Assembly Plant, which closed in 2008. But legend has it that reggae legend Bob Marley worked at the plant during a brief stay in Delaware in the 1960s. Marley resided with his mother in Wilmington. You didn't see that one coming, did you? Now, regardless of where you are, I'm so glad you found the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. And if you're new here, do scroll through the past episodes to get caught up. Lots of great conversations have happened. If you'd like to assist with keeping the podcast going, here's something you can do. Become a monthly sponsor. You can do it for as little as $3 a month, and it helps me with maintaining things on my end. Click the support the show link in the show notes or go to tallmikewine.com for more information. On to episode 51, coming to you from my home studio in Novato, California, where it's laundry day. My guest joining us via Zoom is here for a second time. His first appearance about a year ago was the most listened to episode of 2023. He's been writing about wine, specifically those of the Pacific Northwest, for 20 years. He's the editor and publisher of Northwest Wine Report, and he joins us from Seattle. I like to call him the wizard of Northwest wine, but he's casually known as Sean P. Sullivan. Hey, Sean, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. It's good to be here.
I'm sorry I didn't have time to get a trophy made. Most popular episode of 2023, but nice work on that anyway.
And to you, I was really surprised and gratified to hear that.
Now, let's recap. Last time you were here, you told us you moved to Seattle and sort of became obsessed with Mount Rainier and decided to stay in town and eventually climb the mountain. And while that was happening, you started frequenting local tastings. You eventually visited wineries in the Columbia Valley, and some of your notes got passed around. And before you knew it, you were writing a wine blog. Am I correct here?
Yeah, that's correct. So I grew up on the East Coast, just outside of Boston, and I first came out here when I graduated college in 91. And my brother was going to Evergreen State College out here. So I came out here to spend some time with him that summer. And like a lot of people who come to Seattle during the summertime, fell in love with the area and then spent the next 9 years trying to figure out how to get myself back here permanently. So that finally happened in 2000. And then that was kind of around that same time that the wine bug started biting too. So as you said, I went to a lot of the local tastings, took a local tasting class, and then 2004 started my accidental wine writing career as my friend circulated around my notes that I had passed to him when we'd gone to visit Yakima Valley and Walla Valley.
This is while you were still working a regular job. When did you first write something you got paid for?
That's a great question. So that actually happened in 2010s. So I started out when I moved out here. My background was in science research and medicine. So when I moved out here in 2000, I initially worked at a biotech software company teaching people how to use this software that we had. That was pretty fascinating stuff. And then continued on in the statistical software realm, doing product management, program management, and then towards the end of the aughts was working on an educational software. And so at the end of that year, so that was 2009, my last day of the corporate world, December 31st, 2009. And then starting that next year, I started writing about wine full time. That said, I didn't have any idea whatsoever of how I was going to get paid for it. I was just kind of busily writing away on my site, publishing content 5 days a week, and figured that it was all going to kind of sort itself out at some point, which was a really terrible plan, Mike. Somehow it managed to work.
You just took a leap is what you did.
I took a giant leap of faith, and I thought, like, well, I'll kind of figure this out along the way and see how it goes. And so in the summer of 2010, Seattle Metropolitan magazine here in Seattle was looking for someone to write their top 100 Washington wines list. So they had previously generated this list, and the person who had been writing it prior was no longer able to. So they reached out to the Washington State Wine Commission. So that's a local body here that's charged with promoting Washington wine, and said, hey, do you know anyone who might be good at and interested in writing this a top 100 Washington wines list for our annual issue this year? And so I had done, in 2009, I had done I think a top 50 list, Washington wines list, and listed the wines and why they were there and what have you. So the people at the Wine Commission recommended me for the job of writing this article. So I got together with Seattle Metropolitan and kind of talked about my experience, and they gave me the opportunity to write that article. And that was the cover story for their September issue in 2010. It was pretty exciting for me. You know, I never quite imagined something like that was going to happen. And it was really fun and exciting to do.
It's no surprise to me that you are so good at doing wine reviews, because you come from a background of research and note taking. And we talked about this last time. You're just sort of a natural note taker. Everything in your life, you just sort of notate it, quantify it. So you came up with a top 100 list. That must have been quite an undertaking for somebody who at that point was sort of still on the sidelines as an amateur wine writer. How did you collate 100 wines for the year? Had you tasted 100 wines that year? You had that many notes?
I had, yeah. You know, so at that point, I was tasting around 900 wines a year. I want to say somewhere around there, 900 or 1,000 wines per year for my site, which was, going pretty well. But what I did specifically for that article was I had everyone send in wines, and then I blind tasted them all. So I've been a big advocate of blind tasting over the years. And so I got all these wines delivered to me. I think I want to say it was 600 wines that got sent in.
Okay.
And
so you didn't just go through your notes from the year.
No, I
started from scratch.
Yeah, I started from scratch. And
that's wild.
The reason for that is, you know, wine has a long lag time typically. So wines typically for print publications, as you know, there's a 3 to 4 month lag between when something in to when it actually gets published. So if I had gone with my existing notes, they would have been from, you know, month to whatever back, and a lot of those wines wouldn't have been available. And so I wanted to make sure
they'd have been moved on to the next vintage.
Exactly. So I wanted to try to make sure as many of those wines were available as possible. So I some things I was retasting that I'd tasted before, some things I was tasting for the first time. And that was a pretty, it was pretty intense to taste that many wines over a pretty short period of time. But I just kind of bowled my way through it, and then tried to figure out how I was going to put this list together into the best 100 wines. It was an interesting challenge, trying to balance having different varieties in there, different regions, and what have you, giving the list some balance.
And then at some point you were discovered, or did you submit pieces to the Wine Enthusiast?
So that was the September 2010 issue, and that was my first paid writing that I did. And then towards the end of 2012, I got approached by the Washington State Wine Commission, again, a state mandated body, asking me if I wanted to do some consulting work for them, which I've continued to do ever since. I've continued to write for Seattle Metropolitan magazine ever since writing that article in 2010 as well. Got approached by the Wine Commission about doing some consulting work for them, and I've continued to do that to the present. And then right around that same time, a Wine Enthusiast reached out to me as well and asked if I might be interested in working for them. So I was referred by a friend and colleague, Paul Greggett, who had been writing for them and reviewing for Wine Enthusiasts for a number of years. And Washington has grown so much over the last, 20 plus years. He was just looking for someone to help share that burden with a little bit. So they reached out to me, and we had some conversations to see if I might be interested in doing some reviewing for them. And Paul and I kind of divided up the landscape a little bit. And then the beginning of 2013, I started as a contributing editor at Wine Enthusiast.
And then you just kept plugging away at the blog.
Originally, what I did in 2004 was I was writing this PDF style reports. I did like friends and family email lists. And then I moved that to an online site, Washington Wine Report, in 2007. And then starting, initially when I did it, I was just kind of like, will this blogging technology work, considering the style of reports that I've been doing, which were these, kind of 50, 60 page PDF tomes full of reviews from region visits. Then starting around 2008, I started writing regularly around the blog, and was ultimately 2008-9 onward, generally publishing about 5 days a week there. So when I got the position at Wine Enthusiast, I got backburnered a little bit, and I started to write a little bit less frequently, and also started to republish some content. If I had an article that was published in Wine Enthusiast, well, I would put a link to it on my site. But the writing was a little bit less regular there, mainly in all the work that I was doing at that point for Wine Enthusiast Seattle Metropolitan was all freelance. And freelance writing, as you know, is very much a hunter-gatherer existence. So I always kind of thought, well, to the extent I'm spending time writing on my site, which I very much enjoyed doing, but I was losing money. So I ended up writing more for other places. And around 2013 as well, I started writing for a magazine called Vineyard and Winery Management. Wrote for some other folks. I still posted some things on the site. And certainly if there was something that I really wanted to say that didn't have a good fit elsewhere, I would publish there, but it was definitely not kind of my primary outlet at that point, mainly because I hadn't monetized it. Right around the time I was approached by Wine Enthusiast, I had actually been in the process of planning to rebrand my site from Washington Wine Report to Northwest Wine Report, and I was going to make it a subscription-based site. When they reached out to me, I said, well, that doesn't really make sense for me I was going to monetize my site based off the wine reviews. And I thought, well, if I'm publishing my wine reviews at Wine Enthusiast, doesn't really make sense to do that. So that kind of got pushed back for a little while.
So your long game plan was eventually to get back to focusing on your site and then monetizing it. And you did that not too long after we chatted a year ago. How's it been going?
It's been going well, yeah. So starting in June, left Wine Enthusiast in the summer of 22, then rebranded from Washington Wine Report to Northwest Wine Report that September. And then starting in June of 23, made the site partially subscription-based. Most of the content is still freely available. That's been important to me. I always say to people, I want more folks reading about the goings-on in the Pacific Northwest rather than less. So I've tried to figure out a balance between being able to make a living writing and reviewing about wine, and trying to do that and balance that with accessibility where people can still read the content. So it's been an interesting challenge. I'm doing it on my own site as opposed to a Substack site that a lot of people are doing. So I had a lot of software development to get to that point where, between doing memberships and paywall and subscriptions and financial processing and all that kind of thing. And I also had to migrate from one platform to another. So that was arduous, I will say. Then just trying to hopefully build up subscribership where it can be a sustainable thing. It's gone well. It's certainly exceeded my expectations at this point. It's gotten further at this point than I expected it would. It still has a ways to go, but I'm pleased with where it's gotten thus far.
That's awesome, man. Congratulations. I want to talk a little bit more about people doing this on their own in just a few moments. But first, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to tell me what's in your glass.
Yes. So what I have here today, this is a Pepperbridge 2022 Sauvignon Blanc from Walla Valley.
Sauvignon Blanc from Walla.
You can see.
Beautiful. Hang on. Let me get a picture of that. Hold it up again. There we go. All right.
And so one of the interesting trends that I've seen in Washington of late has been more of a focus on white wines. Washington traditionally, if we go back to the 70s and 80s, was more white wine focused. It was a lot of Riesling. It was
Riesling.
Moving into the kind of 90s and the aughts, it became much more red wine focused. And reds are now about 2/3 of the wines produced. And many of the small wineries, probably between, I would say almost 90% of the wines that they're pouring are red wines at this point. You can charge more for greater prestige, etc. But in recent years, there's been a number of wineries that have been really investing more in white wines in the state. And Walla Valley is interesting in particular because it's traditionally had about 95%, I want to say, of its grapevine plantings are to red wine grapes. So whites were pretty uncommon, and bottles labeled Walla Valley white wines were pretty uncommon. But in the last series of years, there's been a number of different people who have been making white wines. This is, again, Pepperbridge Sauvignon Blanc, Walla Valley 2022 vintage. So it comes from a few different vineyards in the valley. One that's a ridgeline site down to the south. Another that's a site, a higher elevation site in the foothills of the Blue Mountains. So very good fruit ripeness and very good acid retention. And 2022 in particular in Washington was just a great vintage for white wine. It's a really spectacular wine. I'm really excited about it, and excited about Washington whites more generally as an emerging category. I expect that red wines will continue to dominate the state, but I do think we'll see more white wines and more interesting white wines coming out of Washington in the coming years.
I've always been a fan of the Viognier coming out of Washington State.
Absolutely. Viognier was actually one of the earliest Washington white wines I tried from a producer called McRae Cellars, who was really an early pioneer for Rhone varieties in Washington. And I always say of Viognier, it's the best of wines and it's the worst of wines. It's a variety that can be so delicious, and there's a number of producers here in Washington to do it very well, but you've really got to nail that picking decision, or it can get very ripe and very boozy and kind of Jolly Rancher flavored.
Hold up the bottle again. I got a picture of you, but your eyes were closed. Yeah, this is going to go on Instagram, man. So got to make sure it's just right. Thank you. All right.
Really lovely bottle. And again, for the 2022s, it was a cool beginning of the growing season, and that kind of pushed things back, bud break, bloom, the early markers of the growing season, such that the harvest time came much later in the growing season when temperatures tend to cool down. So really nice ripeness of fruit flavors and a lot more acid than we're used to seeing in Washington. Washington is, as you know, a pretty warm climate.
Is that acid manifesting itself in like grapefruit? Are you getting lemon, lime? What are you tasting there?
Yeah, there's this really nice kind of grapefruit filled finish there, where most Washington wines aren't necessarily going to finish with an overt sense of tartness to it, but this has definitely got a little of that pink white grapefruit kind of tartness right on the finish, along with really nice ripeness of fruit flavors for the rest of the palate. It's a really beautiful wine.
Thank you for sharing.
What about you? What's in your glass, Mike?
Oh, what's in my glass? Well, thank you for asking. I have a little bit of a red wine, not from Washington, from France, a wine from the Rhone region of France. It's a region that I love saying, Gigondas.
Yes.
And Gigondas is in the southern part of the Rhone region of France. The Rhone is kind of broken up into two regions, the north and the south. And in the north, the red wine is pretty much all Syrah. And then when you get down into the south, they start growing a lot of Grenache and Mourvèdre and start making a lot of blends that are, well, I guess you could say kind of Washington-like, because the GSM from Washington is kind of a thing now. And Gigondas wines are typically Grenache-based. This one is 80% Grenache and 20% Mourvèdre. It's from a producer called Domaine Saint-Damien. And this is their Gigondas 2007. I decided to find some older wines. Once in a while, it's fun to taste wines that you think might be past their prime.
Yes.
And this wine is actually, I think, right there on the border, because I will take one sip and think, okay, it's starting to lose it a little bit. The color is still there. It's getting a little bit brown, but it's not really bricking much. But you smell it and it's like, okay, that's really like lots of nice bright cherry fruit for a wine that's over 15 years old. It's pretty amazing. But then you get a lot of herbaceousness. And then when I sip it, I think, okay, this is super smooth. It's gotten to that point when you age a red wine and it gets so smooth, but it's just about at that point where it's almost too smooth. Like it's getting like, there's no edge to it. There's no tension. I'm glad I'm drinking it now and not a year from now.
Yeah.
The producer is Domaine, Saint-Damien. This is their Vignes, Gigondas, which means in French, it means old vines. Some of these vines go back to the 1940s.
Very nice. Yeah, as you said, these Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, GSM, or Southern Rhone style blends, however you want to split it, certainly have become very popular in Washington over the last 20 plus years, and really making some extraordinary wines and wonderful compare and contrast to the wines from the Rhone. What are you seeing in terms of aromas and flavors on the?
It's just a lot of cherry, and then you get into the herbs. It's just really like, oh, there's a little sage in there. Oh, there's some bay leaf. And just a hint of like maybe cocoa powder, but not a lot. I don't think this was aged in a lot of new barrels. It doesn't have a sense to me that at any point in its life it was oaky.
Yeah.
I think it was aged in a barrel for a good long time to smooth it out, soften it, to integrate the flavors, but it's very fruit forward. And like I said, herbaceous, a little bit of floral, maybe some rosy things, some dried flowers, that kind of thing. It's really delicious.
Fun to see 16 plus years in at this point.
Let's talk about the technology of what we both are up to here. I say in the closing credits of each show, I'm the producer and editor of the podcast, and literally I do everything, which means I have had to master some technology I wasn't familiar with. And being a guy of a certain age, there are still things I don't quite understand. Are you your own webmaster, IT tech person? Do you make your site happen all by your lonesome?
It is largely by my lonesome, but I do work with developers on it. Having a standalone site that has a paywall to it and web hosting and whatever, there's a good bit of technology that goes on behind there. Could I have done it myself? Well, I would have had to, first of all, get a server to host it on, then get some good protection for that server, then kind of figure out all the hooks into the paywall and what have you. So most of what happens on my site is coming from me, but I do occasionally reach out to a developer I have problems, and certainly to get the paywall end of my site implemented required a great deal of work, close work with a developer to do. So I did my own site, because when you go to my site, it's Sean Sullivan, northwestwinereport.com versus someone going to Substack. So you've seen a lot of writers, some of whom work for publications, some of whom were freelancers or whatnot, have been going to Substack. It's a great universe for people to do something like that. It's a turnkey solution, but ultimately in terms of the branding by and large goes to Substack.
It reminds me of my friend Adam Roberts, who is a guy who writes things about food and restaurants and cooking, and he had his own blog and worked for Food Network for a while. He's been on this podcast. He goes by the name The Amateur Gourmet, and he recently turned on his own Substack. And it seems like people are migrating in that direction, sort of all going off to do their own things. What do you think is happening with journalism in general? Do you think eventually the magazines and things are just going to go away?
It's a great question. I can speak from where I've sat in the media landscape, and certainly, again, wine is very niche. But if I go back almost 15 years ago, Kat is making a guest appearance here.
Oh, hello, kitty. My own cat is sitting at my feet, looking out the window, waiting for the mouse that sometimes wanders onto the patio to appear.
If I go back to almost 15 years ago, when I started doing freelance writing, and I had that article in Seattle Metropolitan, what have you. So, I started out doing some writing for Seattle Metropolitan. That became a regular gig. I added on to that, doing some writing for the Washington State Wine Tour Guide, and then added on to that, writing for Vineyard and Winery Management and a number of other publications along the way. And the idea was to create as many kind of spokes in the wheel or legs to the stool as you could get, where you've got some amount of money coming in here and some amount of money coming in there. And none of them are necessarily a whole lot of money, but when you add them all together,
Right.
they become something where you can make a living as a writer, which has, never been an easy thing to do, right? If we flash forward a little bit and look at this, so I mentioned Vineyard Winery Management. They went away in 2017, so that was a chunk of money there. Washington State Wine Tour Guide, they moved to an online app, so that money goes away. Looking at Seattle Metropolitan, I'm very happy to still work with them, but they have their budget for freelancers is much smaller. They've moved to a quarterly release of their magazine. So the bottom line is, had I stuck with doing this, the overall pool that you have to choose from to write, which again was never an easy way to make a living, and the only way you could keep your head at least reasonably at the waterline, if not a little bit above or below it, is to cobble those things together. But as the different outlets go away, it becomes literally just impossible to do that because there's no one to replace them. So if you were to say, like, okay, this is one of the major outlets I wrote for, they've gone out of business or don't want me to write for them or what have you, I'll go somewhere else. Well, there is no somewhere else.
Right.
So as a result of that, what you've seen, and this is true whether you're looking at wine media or journalists and what have you, is people striking out on their own and saying, maybe I can do as well or better on my own, trying to have my own site. And that trend is absolutely going to continue. Certainly in the wine industry, you've seen a lot of people who used to work at the major magazines itself migrating to focusing on their own work. I think that will continue. I think we'll see more people in other spaces continuing to do that as well. There are questions with that. Number one, as people do that, as you've seen, it's at first when you get cable or what have you, and you say, oh, well, I only have to pay X amount and I get all these channels. That's pretty great. And you're pretty happy about that. So that seems pretty good. Then you've got your Netflix, you've got your HBO, you've got all these different things. And suddenly all those subscriptions add up to a lot of money, right? Will consumers tolerate a media landscape where there's a whole bunch of subscriptions for them to have to pay for and support? Each one of them is relatively modest, potentially, in terms of the value.
Sure. You get you get your Spotify and your Pandora, and they're like $5 a month. That's only $5.
Exactly. And so when you aggregate those things, like, it becomes a fair amount. So will there come a point where people say, all right, I don't want to add any more subscriptions, or maybe I don't want to do any subscriptions at all? I think that's a potential issue there. But I do think that certainly for me, doing what I'm doing now, having full authority over and control over everything I do, one of the things I say to folks is, why would you spend all this time and effort brand building for someone else for not necessarily a whole lot of money when you could be brand building for yourself?
What are some of the current stories on your site? What's the latest buzz from the Pacific Northwest?
It's been an interesting period of time for the Pacific Northwest. If we look at the Washington side of things, a lot of the discussion lately has been around some struggles with Ste. Michelle, largest winery in the state, and they've been kind of pulling back their overall production. And I think that has given people the impression that Washington is struggling. That's very much not true. Washington is, as you know, Mike, is really a tale of two industries. And on the one side, so we've got close to 1,100 wineries here in Washington. Ste. Michelle makes up the lion's share of production. They're one of the largest wineries in America. Most of the wineries that we have here in Washington are really quite small, making less than 5,000 cases, say, per year. Around 90% of wineries are making less than 5,000 cases. So for them, they might make 300 cases of wine, 500 cases of wine, versus Saint Michel's is making tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of cases of wine. And a lot of those small wineries are doing really well. So looking at some recent data for 2023, Washington was the only major wine region where direct-to-consumer sales were up in terms of value and were up in terms of volume. That's terrific news on the Washington side of things, even though there's been this kind of shadow of some of the struggles that Saint Michel has been having. And I should say, too, it's by no means just Saint Michel. Like, the large wine companies are struggling right now because there are very large changes happening in terms of consumer demographics, who's buying wine, how much wine. And so if you're making a lot of wine, you feel those problems much more quickly and much more acutely than if you're making smaller amounts of wine.
It's kind of like the with a situation like Saint Michel, it's almost like the tail starts to wag the dog. They're year after year after year, they're pumping out all this wine. It's hard to slow that down if the sales begin to flag a little bit. Whereas a tiny little winery, they're sort of making wine for their fans. It's like, oh, we're going to make a little bit of wine. And if you make a little bit of wine, you find some people that really love your wine, you can sell it all.
Yeah, exactly. The industry, too, as you know, has very, very long lead times. So the wines that Saint Michel and others were making this year are based on, they'll be selling in 2 to 3 years, right? And what's the market going to look like? What's the demand going to look like? You don't necessarily know. So you can imagine, and this very much turned out to be the case, you're coming into 2018, 2019, the wine industry has been growing for almost 20 continuous years at this point. You're thinking, I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to keep growing with this industry and see if I can get a bigger share.
Keep pushing the throttle.
Keep pushing that throttle. And then along comes 2020, when suddenly the landscape changes radically, right? So you have based a couple years back in terms of what you're looking to sell in 2020, right. And then all of a sudden you have a radically different landscape. And it's what's happening in the wine industry is by no means exclusively related to the pandemic, but it is one of the factors in there. The main thing is the lead times are so long in terms of planning. If you say, my goal is going to be to sell 500,000 cases of wine in 2024, and then let's say in 2023, you sell 300,000 cases of wine. Well, now you're sitting on 200,000 cases of wine that you couldn't sell last year, and you probably got another 200,000 cases of wine that you made in 2024 that you're not going to be able to sell, right? So those problems for big wineries pile up very, very quickly. So certainly in Washington, I think there's been a lot of articles, I've written some of them, about difficulties that Saint Michel is having, and I think that's given this impression Washington more generally is struggling. That's not true.
When that happened, when they cut back their whole buying program, they know we're going to buy 40% less from growers, and everything I read was like doom and gloom, doom and gloom, doom and gloom. I thought about my friend Justin Neufeld, who makes wine in the Yakima Valley, and I thought, he's going to be able to start buying some of those grapes that aren't being bought by Saint Michel. He's probably going to get some deals, and that's good news for him. He's a small producer. So those small producers, it could be good news for them, right?
The landscape is very, very different for them. I mean, there's long been a saying in Washington that as goes Saint Michel, so goes Washington. And the reason being is they've accounted for historically 60+% of the state's overall wine production. They've been the winery that's been traveling around the country and around the world, opening doors for people. I think what we have seen and will continue to see in the coming years is a bit more of a decoupling where, yes, Saint Michel is still important. They will continue very important to what we do here in Washington. But small and mid-sized wineries are a little bit less reliant on them than they might have been in past years. And I think can still continue to show great success. And as you say, there's also opportunity that comes along where some acreage becomes available that wineries might be interested in, some facilities become available, what have you. I wouldn't underscore the difficulty of this transition. Saint Michel has been such an enormous presence here. The transition will be difficult. But again, there's a lot of Washington wineries that are doing really, really well right now and are continuing to show strong growth. So it's very much a tale of two industries.
If it was easy, everybody would do it, right?
Yes. The wine industry is nothing if not challenging, even in the best of times. Right?
Yeah. So you do most of your tasting right there in your house?
Yeah, so all the tastings that I do in terms of review all of my tastings are blind tastings. So they're all conducted here at my house. They're all conducted in the same way at the same time. Something that I'm very personally passionate about is blind tasting to remove biases, positive or negative, that may come from producer or vintage or what have you. All the wines I review on my site, those all get shipped to me. I've got a receiving company that then processes them here, delivers them to me, and then I taste through them and write up notes for them. I used to, historically, many years back before I started working at Wine Enthusiast in 2013, I would travel around and taste wines at tasting rooms and rate wines at tasting rooms. I would not do that anymore. I think it's too problematic. Again, going back to my kind of background on the research science side of things, I want consistency in terms of how I taste, and sitting and tasting wine with a winemaker versus sitting tasting a wine at home versus sitting tasting wine with 100 other wines in a mass tasting. Those are radically different things, and they're going to produce different scores. And I say that because I've done that experiment and I've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I try to do now is level the playing field, taste every wine in the same way, taste every wine blind. It's not a perfect system, blind tasting, certainly, but I do think that it levels the playing field for people, where you see some surprises where you think, wow, this is really impressed by this wine. I don't know anything about this producer, or maybe I haven't been impressed by this producer in the past. And you also see surprises where you think, wow, I expected this wine to be a good bit better than it is. And so I'm a firm believer in blind tasting.
We are recording this episode a few days before the season opener of Major League Baseball. Look, Sean, I got a new Mariners cap. Did you notice?
Love it. Very nice.
Are you a baseball fan?
I have been a baseball fan. Again, I grew up in Massachusetts, so the Red Sox are my hometown team.
And they're in Seattle this Thursday on opening night.
They are. They have been dead to me the past few seasons since trading Mookie Betts and doing a bunch of other moves. So I've followed them very closely for a good long time, going back to even, I guess, preceding the '86 meltdown. But the last few years, I have boycotted them as I don't like the direction the team's gone. So it's been hard to watch them. They haven't played. It's been easier to boycott them because they haven't been playing very well, Mike. Is the bottom line. They've been in the basement. I've not liked many of the changes that they've done with the team, but maybe this will be the year that they start to turn the corner. The Mariners, on the other hand, have been, they were really competitive last year, which was fun to see. My brother, one of my brothers who lives out here in Seattle, he goes to a lot of games during the baseball season. So we've historically gone to a number of the Red Sox games together.
That's awesome. I'm still down here in the Bay Area, where, of course, everybody loves the Giants. And I'm still sporting the Mariner cap during baseball season. Tell us how we sign up for your site and what your subscribers have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. So my site, northwestwinereport.com. So you can just go to www.northwestwinereport.com. You'll see subscribe buttons there over on the left. There's little My Account things over on the right. You can go up there. There's consumer accounts. Those are $120 per year, $12 per month. There's commercial accounts. Those are for wineries. They're about double that on both annual and monthly basis. And then there's enterprise accounts for big folks as well. What that gets you is, number one, access to my wine review database. So all of my tasting notes are stored and saved in a searchable database. So we talked about earlier, whether I did the site myself, certainly the development of that database and the search functionality was something that really required a lot of work to get there. So newly published wine reviews, searchable database full of reviews, I've written a series of harvest reports and information going back to the 2005 vintage in Washington. That's all behind a paywall. Certain high interest articles I've put behind a paywall as well. But again, I've tried to keep as much of the content as I can freely available, really as a way of trying to increase interest about what's going on in the Northwest. People say to me, you should put more of your content behind a paywall. And I say, well, I'm happy to write this glowing story about your winery and how good you are, and put that article behind a paywall where people can't read it unless they subscribe. That's great for me if they subscribe. It's not so great for you.
No.
And that's certainly one of the things I've tried to do by making a decent percentage of my writing freely available is help grow awareness of what's going on here in the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and to a lesser extent, British Columbia.
Yeah, give people a little taste of your vibe for free. And if they like it, they sign up and they'll begin to pay.
Certainly, if I ratcheted up the restrictions and the paywall content, that could bring additional subscriptions to me, and maybe I'll have to go that route. But I say to folks, consider the totality of what I'm writing, and that I would not be able to write that content without subscriptions. And that's quite literally true. I mean, this is my main source of income at this point. So to the extent enough people subscribe, I'll be able to keep going and keep doing it. If enough people don't subscribe, well, then I'll just have to go on and do something else.
What would it be?
That's a great question. I've always wanted to sing, Mike. No.
Oh,
seriously.
perfect.
That's a great question.
I've got the piano over here. We could fire it up.
What would I do? It would be a really interesting thing to think about. I mean, I've always said to folks, I'm doing exactly what I want to do. Like I have the incredible privilege of working my dream career, which is writing about and reviewing wine in the Pacific Northwest. And at this period of time where there's been this tremendous growth in the overall industry here and growth in the number of wineries, increase in quality and what have you, and to be able to be here and write about that and document that has been really the great privilege of my life.
Cool, man. Well, thank you for spending some time with us, and continued success to you.
Thank you, sir.
The Tall Mike Wine Podcast was conceived and is written, produced, edited, and maintained by yours truly. Follow me on Instagram at Tall Mike Wine for peeks behind the scenes of the podcast and my everyday life with wine, food, and my pets. For your very own set of Tall Mike Wine Podcast coasters, or to just ask a question, email me, tallmikewine@gmail.com. You can also help sponsor the podcast. Click on the link in the show notes or go to tallmikewine.com. Every little bit helps a lot. Thanks to Sean P. Sullivan for hanging out. I'll have another episode for you soon, I promise. Until then, from my studio in Novato, California, where it's laundry day, I'm Mike Stone. Keep swirling, keep sniffing, keep sipping. Cheers.